Whenever a legal journalist investigates a story, one of the first things he wants to do is go to the scene of the crime. I'm Lee Strobel, and I've come to Paris, France to investigate a fictional crime that's created a very real firestorm of international controversy. The details are found in novelist Dan Brown's blockbuster book and movie, The Da Vinci Code. This is where the story begins, with the murder of the curator of the Louvre Museum, this former Renaissance palace that houses over 35,000 works of art. His body is found just 30 yards from Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. He leaves behind a series of codes that lead his granddaughter and a Harvard professor on an exciting adventure of discovery. Ultimately, those discoveries expose the most provocative claims of the book, including the stunning allegation that Jesus is married to Mary Magdalene, they had a child named Sarah, and that their descendants are alive today. In fact, Dan Brown suggests that Mary Magdalene is a true Holy Grail, and that her bones and documents about her real identity are buried under this glass pyramid that was added to the Louvre in 1989. Through the centuries, the church has supposedly covered up this explosive fact, as well as suppressed the female role in Christianity. Naturally, this has elicited howls of protest from churches around the world. Even Hollywood couldn't escape the furor when it came time to make the movie. The storyline of the book takes the professor and the curator's granddaughter to London, England, where a climactic scene unfolds inside historic Westminster Abbey. This grand cathedral is the burial place of 3,000 kings and statesmen, poets and scientists, warriors and musicians and others, and is still a functioning church today. Ron Howard, the film's director, fully intended to shoot those scenes here at Westminster, but he was denied access by church officials who disagreed with the contents of the book. For instance, not only does the book say that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had a child, but it also suggests that Jesus isn't the Son of God, that you can't trust the Gospels in the Bible, and that essentially Christianity is based on a fraud. Well, historians and church officials from around the world have disputed those allegations, and yet, because of the clever way in which the book blends fact and fiction, some people believe the allegations are true. The question is, are they? I interviewed Dr. Paul Meyer, a professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University. Dr. Meyer has written more than 250 scholarly articles in various professional journals. He's also the author of the best-selling book, The Da Vinci Code, Fact or Fiction. As well, Dr. Meyer is a best-selling novelist. His novels include Pontius Pilate and A Skeleton in God's Closet. Well, let's talk about how we can know what happened in history. Let's talk about historical events. What determines whether an historical event actually occurred? How do you know, as an historian, that any event in ancient history really took place?
Well, it's a very good question because anything in the past, how do you prove it? This is right. Well, there are various methods. First of all, multiple attestation is one of the criteria for authenticity.
In other words, multiple authors writing about it.
Yeah, different authors writing about the same event. And if they generally agree, fine. And even if they disagree. For example, we have 3 different versions of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD from Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius. All 3 of them say Rome was basically totally destroyed, or Rome was only partially destroyed. But this is not to deny that the Great Fire of Rome happened. We know it did happen.
So there might be some differences in secondary details, but the core is trustworthy because you have multiple
report on it. Another one is an interesting criterion called the criterion of embarrassment. I love this one because very often you can wring more truth out of a hostile source than a friendly source. A friendly source comes along, maybe beefing up its particular role, exaggerating, but when a hostile source concedes something against the direction of its argumentation, but has to concede it because everybody knows it's true, then the ancient historian says, we know that's true. Flavius Josephus, the famous first century Jewish historian, talks about the siege of Masada. Well, you can go to Masada today and see the very snake we talked about 2,000 years ago on the east side of that great crag. And you can see the mole yet, built by the Romans and trying to conquer it 20 centuries ago. We know that Josephus is not kidding us.
So it's sort of like a detective story, isn't it?
You look for the truth, let the chips fall where they may. And what is so incredibly interesting about the chips in the case of Christianity is how most of them fall on the side of supporting the biblical record.
Let's talk about some other documents that the Da Vinci Code uses in a central way. There's an organization, a secret organization, the Da Vinci Code talks about, the Priory of Sion. And they supposedly guard the secret about the descendants of Jesus. And the book makes the claim, Dr. Meyer, that this information about this organization is contained in a cache of secret documents that were actually discovered in the National French Library.
Dan Brown, on the first page of the Da Vinci Code, in 60-point lettering, fact, and he has two items listed, the Opus Dei and the Priory of Sion. Now this is Dan Brown's method. He will have a little, maybe 15 to 20% truth, and the rest is falsehood. But people will then read and think it's all true because they know one part of it is true. Now here's what happens. Opus Dei, of course it's an authentic organization. It's an organization of very conservative Roman Catholics who despair of the fact that the Mass is in English, for example, you know. Okay, but the Priory of Sion, I remember the first time I read the Da Vinci, I'd never heard of him before. I went to a university library, not anything in the Priory of Sion. Then I went to the internet and I found this information in the Priory of Sion located in the same area that covers people who are worried about the Trilateral Commission, Roswell, New Mexico, visitors from outer space. The claim in Dan Brown's novel is that it was founded by Godfrey de Bouillon in 1099 AD in the city of Jerusalem. Well, here are the facts of the matter. It was founded in 1956 in the city of Paris by an anti-Semitic crook and forger named Pierre Plantard. Pierre Plantard planted, if you please, the secret documents in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. A person who helped him in the fraud confessed to the French courts. The entire central strand in the Da Vinci Code is based on a fraud. This is just incredible. And the BBC did a documentary on this. Evidently the news reached the U.S. only with glacial speed.
When you see that as an historian, what does that do to you?
Well, I worry about the truth. I really do, Lee. At this point, what happens if a majority of readers in this novel will believe all the lies that are included in the second half of that book? Will this become eventually the majority opinion? And will those historians who are really seeking the truth be crowded out, you know, in the future? Is this how a devastating turn can take place in civilization, where you have the wrong information now and you base things on the wrong information and the error increases?
There are a lot of claims that Dan Brown makes about Constantine. He says that he was a pagan who only reluctantly converted on his deathbed. He says that he eliminated goddess worship in the Roman Empire, that he's the one that decided what Gospels went into the Bible and what didn't, that he destroyed documents that said that Jesus is merely human and only put in for his own nefarious purposes the Gospels into the Bible, that he's the Son of God. Is this historically reliable information?
I think it's the greatest character assassination I've ever seen in either fact or fiction in my life. And this flies in the face of all the historical evidence we have. He was a true convert to Christianity. After the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the next year he announced the Edict of Toleration for the faith. He had a very pious mother, Helena. He built cathedrals, basilicas as though there were no tomorrow. All the main identification spots associated with Jesus in Palestine are Constantinian construction. Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He couldn't do enough for the church. This is ridiculous to say he was a lifelong pagan. It's simply a bald lie.
Is it true that he's the one that collated the Bible, that he's the one that chose what Gospels went in and what got eliminated?
Yeah, Dan Brown almost makes him the universal editor of the earliest Bible, which is just pathetic. Simply because the canon, that is all the standard biblical books, were known already a century and a half to 200 years before Constantine. Eusebius tells us, the earliest Christian church historian, how the canon had its core and how other books were added later on. But by Constantine's time, it was very, very definite. There's no question about that. And the Council of Nicaea in 325 did not decide which books should go in the canon or which should not under Constantine's advice. Nothing of that is true. Not one of the canons or decrees of the Council of Nicaea deals with the canon, for example. So again, you simply have falsehood multiplied here.
Now, some people scoff at the Da Vinci Code and they say, well, you know, come on, Dr. Meyer, it's just a novel.
Lee, whenever I give a lecture on this or whatever else and the Da Vinci Code comes up, this is the commonest reaction I get. Come on, chill out, Meyer, it's a novel. And it's a good challenge, and of course the answer is simply this. In a novel, you have foreground characters and you have background setting. Now the foreground characters, do with them what you want. I would never criticize Dan Brown for whatever he might say about his fictional characters. That's his privilege as a novelist. I'm not knocking that at all. But the setting, the background, the rear episodes that are well known from history should not be tampered with in the interests of credibility. If Dan Brown were using the same rules that he used for the Da Vinci Code to write a novel about World War II, he would have Hitler winning the war and putting Roosevelt on trial in Washington, D.C., and Churchill on trial in London. That's how bad it is. And people who don't know history, who aren't aware of the past, might think, well, what do you know? That must have happened. It's in print. That's the danger.
When Westminster Abbey refused to open its doors for Ron Howard to film scenes for the Da Vinci Code, Howard decided to take his crew and actors and travel 2 hours north of London to a little town called Lincoln. This town is home to one of the finest medieval buildings in all of Europe, the Lincoln Cathedral. Parts of this magnificent edifice date all the way back to the 11th century. Even though Lincoln Cathedral officials also adamantly disagreed with many of the historical claims in the Da Vinci Code, they thought the best approach was to remain open and to invite vigorous debate. And so they allowed Ron Howard to come in and film 3 scenes for the movie. Come on, let's go inside. The Lincoln Cathedral Library contains a breathtaking array of ancient books and manuscripts, including one of the 4 surviving copies of the Magna Carta, a book of sermons from the 10th century, and even the first recorded rhyme about Robin Hood. But how do we know that any of these ancient books are telling us the truth about history? To explore the reliability of the New Testament and the Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, I interviewed Dr. Scott McKnight. He's a professor at North Park University near Chicago. He got his doctorate from the University of Nottingham, not far from here. He's the author of 10 books, including The Jesus Creed and Embracing Grace. He's a recognized expert on Jesus studies. And Dr. McKnight, there's some people who read the Bible and they seem to accept it without questioning it at all. Is that a good idea?
It's a good idea to trust the Bible, but we usually gain trust because we've gained confidence to trust the Bible. And sometimes it takes time for us to study and come to conclusions that this Bible can be trusted. We should follow our questions.
So what about people who read Dan Brown's book and are willing to accept that without really questioning it?
It's an amazing phenomenon, the number of people who love the Da Vinci Code. And this is, I think, one of the most important questions that we need to ask about the Da Vinci Code. Why is everyone reading it? Why want to believe it? And I think the operative word here is suspicion. Over the last century, many people have become suspicious of the church and what the church has done. And we think of the scandals among Roman Catholic priests, scandals among televangelists. The rise of the women's movement has generated interest in the Da Vinci Code. Postmodernity and its questioning of truth, the rise of pluralism, all these things filter into why people want to believe what's in the Da Vinci Code, because it's not good history, but people still want to believe the general message. And I think many people have been hurt by the church, and they see things in the Da Vinci Code that they want to hear. One of the alarming parts of Dan Brown's a so-called historical treatment of the rise of the Bible and the Gospels is that he claims that there are 80 Gospels that were used and people voted on which ones were reliable. And we don't know where he came up with that number 80 because there aren't that many. But what is most alarming is that the Gospels that were not included in the New Testament are in fact much more supernatural. They presented Jesus who is much more magical than anything close to what we find in the New Testament. The Gospels that survive, that are in our New Testament, emphasize the humanity and the deity, whereas the Gospels that didn't survive are so incredibly supernatural that he's no longer walking on planet Earth. When Jesus said the things that he said, and when he did the things that he did, people walked away talking about what Jesus said and did. Those memories were passed on in a Jewish world from person to person and became the Gospels that we have. Here's the fact. Jesus spoke, Jesus acted. The early apostles remembered what Jesus said. The Jewish world was fantastic at remembering things. And the Gospels are the result of a long process of early Christians getting together, telling one another what was going on, and this memory of the apostles became literary texts, and they were all formed by 70 AD in the first century, within a generation of the life of Jesus. And these are the Gospels that stuck and shaped the story of early Christianity. The second, third, and fourth century Gospels were attempts to make a Jesus that fit another set of theological categories rather than the Gospels that gave rise to the Orthodox Christian creeds that we now all confess.
And so the end result, you believe, is a set of 4 Gospels that are essentially trustworthy.
Trustworthy, reliable, understanding of who Jesus was, but they are clearly a presentation of Jesus as the Son of God. One thing Dan Brown will admit is that the Gospel's presentation of Jesus is consistent with what Christians have always believed about Jesus. But that is not, for him, the only picture of Jesus. The only way he can get another picture of Jesus is to add to the Gospels with Gospels that were not considered authentic and are not reliable history, or to subtract from the Gospels that we have. And one of the underlying themes of the Da Vinci Code is to say that the Gospel records distorted the facts of history. Distorted facts about Mary Magdalene, distorted facts about Jesus. But anytime the Gospel records themselves, in modern historical criteria, they come up smelling pretty good.
What would some of the criteria be to determine whether or not these Gospels are reliable?
Whether they fit a first century Jewish context, whether they're the sort of thing that is consistent from one end to the other of the Gospel, whether there are multiple witnesses to the same event. For instance, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each testify to the resurrection with independent stories. These sorts of criteria are what historians have always used to measure whether a text is recording reliable history or not. I believe in the Gospels not only because after 30 years of studying them, I find them to be reliable over and over again, but because in studying the Gospels, I encounter Jesus. And the Jesus that I've encountered has changed my life.
Officials at Lincoln Cathedral were right when they said that the claims of the Da Vinci Code collapse upon full and open scrutiny. The 4 Gospels in the New Testament even managed to convince an atheist like I was that they contain accurate information about the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus. First, I became convinced that they are rooted ultimately in either direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. Secondly, they were written so close to the events that they can't be the product of legend. Third, they contain embarrassing material about the disciples and hard-to-explain sayings by Jesus that certainly would have been edited out had the writers felt the freedom to manipulate or whitewash the record. And fourth, archaeology and ancient writings outside the Bible tend to corroborate what the New Testament says. The fanciful, apocryphal Gospels that were written much later come nowhere near having the credentials of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Even the critical German scholar Peter Stuhlmacher said recently, We have good reasons to treat the gospel seriously as a source of information on the life and teachings of Jesus, and thus on the historical origins of Christianity. I'd encourage anyone, including you, to seriously investigate the credentials of the Gospels with an open mind, and then ask yourself this life-changing question: what is the central message that these writings have for me personally? More than 800 years of history, going back to the Crusades, are embodied in the Temple Church. It's also the scene of a heart-stopping encounter in the Da Vinci Code, as opposing forces try to track down the Holy Grail. What's really interesting, though, is the connection between the Church and the Knights Templar. According to Dan Brown, the Knights Templar was a religious and military organization of the Middle Ages that guarded the secret about Mary Magdalene. She was the bearer of Jesus' royal bloodline and the real Holy Grail. There's no question that the Knights Templar actually existed, or that they built this medieval church right here in the heart of London. You can see the evidence of that in these life-size stone effigies of knights. There are 9 of them embedded in the floor of the church. They date back to the 1200s. And you can see the evidence in the building's circular design, which is reminiscent of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the holiest place for the Crusaders. What is in hot dispute, however, is the claim by Dan Brown that the Knights Templar were the protectors of the secret that Jesus wanted his church to be run by Mary Magdalene. You see, a central claim of Dan Brown's book and movie is that power-hungry men stole the church from Mary Magdalene and systematically suppressed and devalued women through the centuries. But what is the real role of women in Christianity? What was Jesus' attitude toward women? And has the church managed to embody that value through the years? Was Jesus the original feminist, as Dan Brown claims? Does the church really view women as the enemy? And to what degree was the sacred feminine present among the earliest Christians? To get answers to these and other related issues, I sat down with Dr. Kathy McReynolds. Well, let me read you a quote from Dan Brown's novel, and where he talks about women, and something from the book of Genesis, from the Bible, the first book of the Bible. He says, "The power of the female and her ability to produce life was once very sacred, but it posed a threat to the rise of the predominantly male church, and so the sacred feminine was demonized and called unclean. It was man, not God, who created the concept of original sin, whereby Eve tasted of the apple and caused the downfall of the human race. Woman, once the sacred giver of life, was now the enemy." Is that what happened?
I don't think the church views women as the enemy at all. The enemy was clearly the serpent in the garden, if you will. If you want to call anybody or anything an enemy, it would be the serpent. It's not. Women have not been viewed as an enemy in the church.
Dan Brown talks in his book a lot about the sacred feminine. To what degree was this present among the early Christians?
It wasn't present at all. From 1st century on to 2nd century writings, Gnostic writings, through the 3rd century, it is simply not there. In fact, there's evidence quite to the contrary that from 1st century on, Jesus and his followers saw God as Father, and that is very consistent throughout early church history.
So if we go back to Jesus, this idea of the sacred feminine is not found in his teachings or in his life in the 1st century ministry of his that we see reflected in the Gospels.
Not in his ministry, not in the writings of Paul, not in the writings even from the Gnostic Gospels in the 2nd and 3rd century. It's not there.
So it's a little bit ironic then that if Dan Brown likes to quote a lot from these later Gospels, that these are Gospels in which women are viewed less favorably than we see Jesus treating them in the original Gospels.
Yeah, that's what you're going to find. From Gospel of Thomas to Mary, those that we have available to us, women are not viewed in a very favorable light.
Now, Dan Brown says that the marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene is part of the historical record, and that the biggest cover-up in human history is that he fathered a child through her. Do you believe there is credible historical evidence that Jesus and Mary Magdalene really were married?
There's not a shred of credible evidence at all.
Nothing.
That they were never, not a thing. Not in the canonical Gospels, not
Which
in
means
Paul's,
the Gospels in the Bible.
Exactly, the four Gospels, not in Paul's writing. And Paul is one that even talks about marriage. And if Jesus was married, you would certainly think that he would mention it, since he addresses that in the book of 1 Corinthians. You don't see it in any of the 2nd or 3rd century Gnostic Gospels. It is not mentioned anywhere.
So even in the later Gospels that aren't in the Bible, that are kind of what you call the apocryphal Gospels, that don't have the same historical credibility that the Gospels in the Bible have, but even in those, you don't see the marriage, is what you're saying?
Not a single mention. And you would think such an important issue would be mentioned.
Would it be a theological problem if Mary and Jesus had been married?
I think that there is a theological difference. It is not that there is anything wrong or sinful with marriage. That's not the point. The point is that Jesus had a special mission, as a very unique mission as the Son of God and the Savior of the world. And he stands in a long tradition of prophets that were set aside by vows to God, much like the Nazarite vows. And so he was in that tradition, and I think it is a theological difference.
So you're saying that he was in a line of tradition where people would consecrate themselves to God, or have a vow of chastity, that their life would be focused on God?
Absolutely. And he definitely stands in that tradition, much like John the Baptist and so forth. So I think it does make a theological difference.
So when we hear people say, well, you know, a rabbi in the 1st century would never be single, he'd certainly always be married, so Jesus must have been married, that really doesn't carry much weight.
No, it doesn't, because in the community of the Essenes, you had many rabbis and Jewish teachers who were not married. It was not required that in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that there were many rabbis who weren't married.
Then what about Dan Brown's contention that the Last Supper painting by Da Vinci, in his words, practically shouts at the viewer that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were a pair? Does that painting shout that to you?
No, it doesn't, and it doesn't shout it to most art historians either. Many art historians recognize this as John the Apostle, and there's 3 reasons for that. John is not seen anywhere else in the painting. Secondly, John is often depicted as being more feminine looking. And third, and probably most importantly, is that Da Vinci himself recognized this as John the Apostle, and he said so in his early sketches.
Oh, his early sketches actually indicated that this was John, not Mary Magdalene?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, that's pretty authoritative, I would say.
I would say from the man himself.
Now, Dan Brown says, at this point in the Gospels, Jesus suspects he will soon be captured and crucified. So he gives Mary Magdalene instructions on how to carry on his church after he is gone. As a result, Peter expresses his discontent over playing second fiddle to a woman. I dare say Peter was something of a sexist. Sophie looked at him. You're saying the Christian church was to be carried on by a woman? That was the plan. Jesus was the original feminist. He intended for the future of his church to be in the hands of Mary Magdalene. Now, Dr. McReynolds, is there any evidence historically that this was Jesus' intent, and yet it was power-hungry, sexist men like Peter that frustrated the instructions that Jesus wanted to be carried out, and that men took over the church and snatched it away from the rightful heir, Mary Magdalene?
This idea comes from the Gospel of Mary, which is a Gnostic gospel that was written in the latter part of the 2nd century. And in that gospel, Jesus gives Mary Magdalene a revelation, but it has nothing to do with her carrying on the church. It has to do with finding salvation for souls.
So are you telling me that inside the Bible and outside the Bible, there is not one bit of evidence in history for this assertion that Jesus wanted Mary Magdalene to run the church?
No, there is not. There is not.
Is it true, though, as Dan Brown asserts, that Mary Magdalene was demonized by the church? She was shunned by the church. She was falsely accused of being a prostitute in order to discredit her.
This idea comes from a sermon that was given by Pope Gregory the Great 500 years after the Gospels were written. In that sermon, he talks about the prostitute that's found in Luke 7 as being Mary Magdalene. Most scholars agree that this cannot be Mary Magdalene for one primary reason. Luke in chapter 8 introduces Mary Magdalene for the first time, so it cannot be her. And I don't think that his purpose in using Mary Magdalene and referring to her as a prostitute there was to demonize her anyway. I think he was setting up an illustration to show if Jesus could forgive a prostitute, then the average sinner certainly can find forgiveness as well. The only thing we know about her background essentially is that she had 7 demons that Jesus cast out of her, and that comes in Luke 8.
How should Mary Magdalene be viewed today?
She was given a status to the point that where she is the first witness and the most prominent witness of his resurrection, and she goes to tell about it. And what is more interesting too about John's portrayal of Mary, which I think is fundamental and probably her greatest legacy, is that in John 10, Jesus is portrayed as the great shepherd, and his disciples hear his voice. And when Mary is at that tomb and Jesus speaks her name, she recognizes him. And this is all to indicate that she is not only a witness but a disciple and a learner of Christ. And then she goes on to proclaim it. And as many have said, she is the apostle to the apostle. In that sense, there's another aspect of her legacy, where on the one hand she is taking on and assuming new roles as a disciple, which is revolutionary in that time. You know, Dan Brown is a fiction writer, and he writes good fiction, and he's given us a very solid page turner. But when it comes to the reality of day-to-day life in the church and the history of the church, he's missed the mark.
This is Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. Notre Dame, of course, means Our Lady. It's a reference to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Even though the Da Vinci Code makes the claim that the church has failed to esteem women, one obvious contradiction and omission is Mary, who the church has certainly revered through the centuries, as evidenced by credible edifice. As for Jesus himself, he had a revolutionary attitude toward women in a day when they had little social value. Said Rebecca Jones in her new book, Does Christianity Squash Women? Jesus never slanders or belittles women. He does not make generalizations about them. He does not shut them out of conversations or ignore them. He doesn't make them feel small or relegate them to an inferior status. Everything he says and does in relation to women shows the utmost care and respect. Has the church always lived up to those ideals? No, unfortunately not. But that's a reflection on the human beings who run the institution, not on Jesus himself. Our eyes ought to be on him and his teachings. Forget the revisionist history of the Da Vinci Code. There's no reputable historians who believe that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene or that he wanted her to run the church. Instead, men and women can find hope in the true ideals of Christianity that are reflected in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. It says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. I'm back at Lincoln Cathedral, where things aren't always what they seem to be. Director Ron Howard had to use some Hollywood trickery to create the illusion that this is really Westminster Abbey in London. For instance, take a look at this beautiful marble statue. Could be hundreds of years old, but you know what? It's actually styrofoam. I mean, Hollywood is absolutely amazing, isn't it? Take a look at this piece. It's plywood. Or come over here to these beautiful frescoes painted on solid stone. Actually, though, it's canvas. I mean, it's an incredible illusion, isn't it? Well, Dan Brown suggests that there's a more insidious illusion, and that is that Jesus is the Son of God. He says in the Da Vinci Code that the followers of Jesus thought that he was a mere man, and it wasn't until hundreds of years later that Emperor Constantine deified him for his own nefarious purposes. But is that really true? Has the church been covering up the fact that Jesus is a mere human being? Or was Dan Brown rewriting history? To get solid answers, I interviewed Dr. Mark Strauss, who earned his doctorate from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He's been a professor for more than a dozen years at Bethel Seminary in San Diego. He's written a number of books about Jesus in the New Testament, including his most recent, 4 Portraits, 1 Jesus. Dr. Strauss, let me begin by reading an excerpt from the Da Vinci Code. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea, that would have been in the year 325. Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal. By officially endorsing Jesus as the Son of God, Constantine turned Jesus into a deity. Many scholars claim that the early church literally stole Jesus from his original followers, hijacking his human message, shrouding it in an impenetrable cloak of divinity, and using it to expand their own power. How much of that is truth and how much of it is fiction?
That's an extraordinary statement of revisionist history. And in fact, I was reading the book. When I was reading the Da Vinci Code, I was quite enjoying it. It's quite a murder mystery and fascinating, and each chapter leaves you hanging and leads to the next. I got to that chapter and suddenly it spoiled the book for me, because what you have in that chapter is you have 2 supposed experts, historical experts, and all of a sudden they're spouting absolute historical nonsense that any historian could tell you is pure nonsense, pure gibberish.
So this was not the first time in 325 AD that Jesus was declared deity?
Absolutely not. The Council of Nicaea was extraordinarily important, 325. The conversion of Constantine, the first emperor to become a Christian, was enormously important for the church. It freed the church now no longer to have to suffer persecution and so forth. But the idea that Constantine and the Council of Nicaea made Jesus divine, made him into a deity from a mere mortal prophet, is ridiculous. The church had been declaring Jesus deity for centuries. Even the early church fathers, the church historians, the second generation after the apostles, when they're talking about the false teachers, the heretics, the Gnostics that Dan Brown talks about, and they refer to their teachings and their writings, they don't tend to refer to other gospels. What they say is they say these false teachers are taking the gospels, the 4 gospels, and distorting them. So what is that telling you? That's telling you that the church as a whole recognized that these documents were the authentic gospels, and even these false teachers, these Gnostics, these other groups that Dan Brown refers to, recognized these 4 gospels as the church's gospels, the authoritative accounts. And so they took those gospels and would edit them, would change them, and then they would then begin to write their own versions of the text, their own gospel.
Well, let's talk about what the gospels then, if these are the most reliable documents we have. Does Jesus in these Gospels, does he come out and make the claim that he is God?
Absolutely. Jesus makes the claim that he is God. In John's Gospel, chapter 8, Jesus is in a dialogue with his opponents, his Jewish opponents, and they claim Abraham as their father. And Jesus responds and he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." Kind of a strange response, an interesting response. And what is obvious from that response is Jesus is in fact referring to Exodus chapter 3 in the Old Testament, where God reveals himself to Moses as the I am. It's a claim to deity. It's a claim to pre-existence. It's a claim to be the creator of the universe. So here Jesus is, and he identifies himself as the I am, the God of the Old Testament. Now we know that's what he meant because the immediate response from the authorities is they pick up stones to stone him to death. They recognize that he's making a claim to be God.
Well, I guess anybody can make a claim that they're the Son of God, but as you say, Jesus actually convinced his followers that he is God, and people through the centuries, millions and millions of people have believed that. What evidence is there really to support that claim, to back it up? What credentials does Jesus offer to convince us?
Well, I think that the greatest and final evidence, as Jesus himself said, is his resurrection from the dead. He made extraordinary claims about himself, and then he predicted that he would rise from the dead. Everything he said could have been disproven if that hadn't happened, but in fact, it happened. And the evidence for the resurrection is really extraordinary.
How about for you personally? Do you believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the ultimate authentication of his claim to being the Son of God?
Absolutely. And I think the historical evidence for the resurrection is really overwhelming when you approach it, even from a skeptic's perspective, when you approach it. Just 5 basic, almost indisputable historical facts related to the resurrection. The first, that Jesus died on the cross. The Romans were good at what they did, that he died on the cross. Secondly, that he was buried, in fact. We have the name of the owner of the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea. Not only that he was buried, but that 3 days later the tomb was empty. Jesus' opponents never claimed that the tomb wasn't empty. They could have gone and got the body and shown the body to prove that he hadn't risen from the dead. Instead, they said the disciples stole the body, so that the tomb was empty. Fourth, that Jesus' followers saw Jesus alive, that they are willing to die for that claim. They saw Jesus alive, and that the disciples' lives were absolutely transformed. These people were willing in Jerusalem to proclaim the resurrection, even though they faced almost certain death.
Well, one Muslim friend of mine claims there's a contradiction in the Christian belief, because Christians believe that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And he said to me, Lee, to be human means to have limitations, and be divine means to have no limitations. So Jesus cannot be limited and unlimited at the same time unless he's schizophrenic. So, is Jesus schizophrenic?
The New Testament actually addresses the issue of how Jesus can be both human and divine. It remains a mystery. I think the incarnation, that God became a man, will always remain a mystery. But Paul talks about it in Philippians chapter 2. He says that though Jesus existed in the very form of God, though by very nature he was God, he emptied himself. When he became a human being, he emptied himself. Now, what exactly does that mean? We don't know all that entails, but it certainly means that he set aside the independent exercise of his divine attributes.
Dr. Strauss, some people, many people as a matter of fact, find the idea that God came and lived among us to be a very hopeful and a very positive thought. But it generates hostility from a lot of people. Some people just get angry at this very idea. Why is it that the claim of Jesus, that he's the Son of God, the unique Son of God, why does that spark so much opposition?
That's a good question. I think there's various reasons. One is there's an internal difficulty in the logic of it for us as human beings. We are human beings, and so for us to try to conceive what it would be like to be both human and divine is very difficult to think about. And so throughout history, people who have struggled with that idea have tried to solve the mystery of the incarnation by coming down on either one of two sides, either denying Jesus' deity on the one hand, or denying his humanity. Those who deny his humanity claim that Jesus wasn't truly a human being. He only appeared to be a human being. That's called docetism, from a Greek word meaning to appear or to seem like that. Those who deny his deity claim that he was really just a human being, just a mere human being, a good prophet, a good man, maybe a very powerful individual in a lot of different ways, but that his later followers turned him into a god. And so there's an attempt to solve the logic. We want things to work out clearly in our mind. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another reason is we are by nature fallen human beings and in rebellion against God. And to acknowledge that Jesus is in fact truly human and truly God means that he has certain claims on our lives. And we don't want to submit to those claims on our lives. We don't want to depend on him for our salvation, because it means we have to let go. Jesus said, if anyone wants to follow me, they have to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And that means we have to give up our own life and give our life to him. And by nature, we don't like to do that. We don't like to give up ourselves to someone else and our independence to someone else.
Well, Dr. Strauss, if it is true that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and I think you've given us good evidence that he did make that claim, and if it's true that he backed that up by the resurrection, and as you say, there's solid historical reasoning to believe that the resurrection actually occurred, then what are the implications for all of us today living in the 21st century? What should that mean for us?
Well, these are really the fundamental questions of life, right? Every human being looks around at the world around them and they say, why are we here? Is there a purpose and meaning for life? Well, if Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God, who came to earth to reverse the effects of our fallen human nature, the effects of our fallen creation, then that is the answer to the most ultimate and deepest questions of life. Why are we here and where are we going? And so every person needs to ask that question. If Jesus is indeed truly God, if he's truly a true human being, if he suffered and died for my sins, then I need to respond in faith to him. I need to trust him as my personal Savior.
I'm here at Highgate Cemetery in North London to wrap up our time together. Let me end by asking you this question. What if the person buried in this tomb were to suddenly burst forth alive? I mean, that'd be incredible, wouldn't it? Well, everything boils down to the question of whether Jesus Christ did something similar 2,000 years ago. Even in the earliest gospel, Jesus clearly makes the claim that he is the Son of God. His disciples understood he was making that claim. In fact, his opponents understood it too, because they accused him of blasphemy for daring to equate himself with God. The question is, did he back up that claim by returning from the dead? Well, personally, I think the evidence for the resurrection is clear and convincing. First, everyone in the ancient world agreed that the tomb of Jesus was empty on that first Easter morning. The question was, how did it get empty? The opponents of Jesus made up the story that the disciples had stolen the body, even though they lacked the motive or the opportunity. Nobody believes that. Secondly, Jesus appeared alive to more than 515 eyewitnesses, including skeptics whose lives were changed 180 degrees by encountering the resurrected Jesus. Third, we have ancient records about the resurrection of Jesus Christ that go back so early that they cannot be the product of legendary development. And fourth, the disciples were willing to die for their belief that Jesus is the Son of God, who proved it by returning from the dead. They didn't just believe this was true. They were in a position to know for a fact that Jesus had returned from the dead. And knowing it as a fact, they were willing to die for it. No one knowingly and willingly dies for a lie. Friends, compared to the avalanche of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Dan Brown offers nothing with any credibility to support his allegations. The verdict of history is clear. Jesus, who he claimed to be. And so that leaves us with one last question. How should you respond to it?